All right, so the cell membrane questions. Number 1, identify 3 macromolecules that are components of the plasma membrane in a eukaryotic cell and discuss the structure and function of each. Many of your answers were pretty thin, pretty skimpy on the info. So let's talk about some macromolecules. So the most common option that you would pick would be either a lipid or a phospholipid. And structurally, how would you describe this molecule?
I suppose that a fatty lipid tail and phosphate.
Good. You might also want to add to this that the fatty lipid tail is hydrophobic and the phosphate head is hydrophilic, because those structural components are actually very important to the function of the molecule in the cell membrane, right? So what is the function of the lipid/phospholipid in the membrane? Yep, it forms a lipid bilayer that is semi-permeable. Okay, semi-permeable is a very important function of that membrane to talk about. It is. Semi-permeable is a good word to add. Let's see. You could also say that it is a barrier from it's a barrier between the internal and external cellular environment. Would be another function of the cell membrane. Okay, so we have the macromolecule is the lipid or the phospholipid. We have the structure, some structural features of that molecule, and then the function of that particular macromolecule. What's another macromolecule that is located in the cell membrane? Proteins. And structurally, how would you describe proteins? This goes back to the last unit when we talked about macromolecules. Yep. Good. They are made of a carboxyl and amino group. It is a chain of amino acids. You could call it a polypeptide. Absolutely. What else is structurally significant about them? Yep, the R group determines the function of the protein. You could also talk about the primary, secondary, tertiary, and quaternary structures, and the importance of folding for that particular molecule. And then how about the function? What can you say about the function of the protein? What is its job in the membrane?
Transport materials. Specifically to the active transport.
Okay. Yep, that's good. Anything else that those proteins are responsible for? That's the big one, is transport. Transporting things across the membrane. Good. And then this is where it starts to get a little more difficult because
Positive about this one.
those are the two most common. There are actually two more options that you could have talked about. You could have talked about another lipid specifically. Cholesterol is another macromolecule because it is a lipid. It is a lipid that can be embedded in the bilayer. Structurally, it has a ring structure, would be a description of it. And similar to phospholipids, it is considered, this is a new word for you here. Make sure I spell it right. Amphibatic, meaning that it likes and dislikes water, like phospholipids. So it has some components of it that like water, that are hydrophilic, and some components that are hydrophobic. So that would be another way that you could describe cholesterol. And then the function of it is actually that it stabilizes the membrane. And that it moderates fluidity. How fluid, how much the membrane. So those phospholipids are really small in there. So if you took a bunch of really small things and lined them up, it would actually be like really floppy almost. But a cholesterol molecule is bigger, so it's almost like having a big chunk of something that helps to kind of not make it so floppy. I don't know, it's hard to explain.
It's a little more structural.
It does, it stabilizes a little bit. Yep. Your other option for this, there was one more option that you could have talked about, and that was a carbohydrate. Carbohydrates are embedded in the membrane as either glycolipids or glycoproteins, but glyco itself means carbohydrate. And then the function of that is actually, there are two different functions. One of them is for cell recognition. It's like a name tag for a cell so that they can recognize each other. It's really important, especially for the immune system, for your body to recognize what belongs to you and what doesn't belong to you. So all cells have some kind of name tag or a marker, and it's usually a carbohydrate-based molecule. In a lot of the diagrams, it looks like a weird little tree branch sticking out of the cell membrane diagrams. Those are glycoproteins or glycolipids. It needs either that lipid or protein base to hold it in the membrane itself, but then the carbohydrate sticks out, and the shape of that carbohydrate is unique to you. You have your own set of these carbohydrates that identify your cells as yours. So your cells for your immune system will identify either self versus non-self. And they use these carbohydrates in the membrane to do that. So that's a little more than what we've done so far, but you get a little extra info here on that one. So they're responsible for cell recognition. In addition to that, they could also help as attachment points to other cells. We talked about those cellular junctions. Remember the one that looked like a little piece of Velcro as the cell moved in that cell video that we watched? Those are made of carbohydrates, those particular cell junctions there. Number 2, the relationship of structure to function is one of the major themes in biology. Describe the molecular structure of the cell membrane and then explain how the function of the cell membrane is related to its structure. This is very similar to what we just talked about. This is actually a short free response question that it pulled from an old exam. Structurally, what could you say about the cell membrane?
Cell membrane, 2 layers of phospholipids. Oriented with the hydrophilic end towards the outside inside, and the hydrophobic tail.
Good. Those two layers of phospholipids are oriented, so the hydrophilic heads, those phosphate heads, are pointing outwards towards the water, the watery environment, and then the hydrophobic tails are kind of tucked on the inside. Good. And what's the function of this lipid bilayer? Just like in the last one, it separates the internal and external cellular environment. Right? It keeps all the organelles inside. We don't want the things inside the cell to just float out of it. We want that semi-permeable membrane. Just said the wrong thing there. Good. And then another thing, another structural feature are those embedded proteins. Oh my goodness. So those are responsible for facilitating the transport of materials into and out of the cell. And we will talk about numbers 3 and 4 in class the next time we meet.